Hello and welcome to Electoral Dysfunction. It's parliamentary recess, so we've got a bumper questions and answers episode to keep you going whilst MPs are not sitting. Ruth's here as always. Ruth, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, we are more than halfway through the Scottish school holidays now, and it's the first holidays where I've had my son not in nursery, so I've been doing like childcare the whole time and trying to work full time.
Mine are teenagers now, so all I try and do is spend time with them, and they don't want to spend time with me, but that's a whole other spin-off podcast which I'm going to launch. Anyway, we've had loads of great suggestions for guests after we said goodbye to Jess, including this message from Harry. He WhatsApped us to say, "Whenever I saw this person on the telly, I always thought they'd be great in the cabinet, and I was sad to hear that they had lost their seat in the election. They'd be a good guest for your podcast and offer a different perspective." So welcome, Jon Ashworth.
Hello, and thank you to Harry, was it?
Yeah, it was Harry.
It was actually me pretending to be Harry, to be honest, and I'm pleased that my plan has come together. So, thank you, Harry, and if you're out there listening, I hope I don't let you down in this podcast.
Yeah, okay, no pressure, because I should also say you are the first ever, and maybe the last, male politician to be on this podcast. The only other man that has appeared is Ryland Clark.
Well, I'm a natural successor to him, obviously.
I mean, seriously, this pod, man, we're cooking on gas, eh? Now, a lot of our listeners will probably recognise you because you were Labour MP for Leicester South for 13 years, and during that time, you popped up on telly a fair amount in many of your shadow cabinet roles. You actually were a total media operator, really, weren't you? Whenever there was a difficult thing to do, it was like, let's roll out Jon Ashworth. He can handle anything. Am I correct, or am I correct?
I was a regular on television. I was rolled out week after week, sometimes day after day, and I've been doing that for many, many years. But look, politics is fickle. It's a roll of the dice. And look what happened to me. I'm no longer a member of Parliament.
Ruth and I were on telly live on election night, and I have to say, when your result came in, my jaw hit the floor. It was the most shocking result of the night for me personally.
Well, it was a shock to me. It's obviously brutal to lose, unexpected, although we knew it was very difficult in the Leicester South campaign, and I think there's been some reports about what went on in that campaign, a very nasty campaign. I didn't think it would be as bad as it was, or I certainly knew it was going to be very close. But look, in the end, if a big part of your constituency feels that the campaign is a referendum on one issue, Gaza, and felt that somehow I was responsible for the absolutely horrific scenes that we have seen in Gaza, it's very difficult to try and persuade people that that is not the case. Even though we were actually calling for the things that people wanted us to do and demanding of us, people still somehow thought that I was responsible for the horrific loss of life in the region. But it's very difficult to overcome that.
And a number of your colleagues also nearly did lose their seats. Shabana Mahmood, our own Jess Phillips, Wes Streeting, other people that I guess at the time wasn't on the front bench, but other shadow cabinet, now into cabinet members. And you lost, but a lot of people came close, didn't they?
They certainly did. But look, one of the first things that the Labour government did was that when the Foreign Secretary spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel, he told him we wanted to see a ceasefire. One of the first things the Labour government did was restore the UN funding. The Labour government is talking about Palestinian statehood as part of a two-state solution. That is because we have a Labour government, not because we have a bunch of independent MPs who, frankly, are pretty impotent. I think you're already seeing the parliamentary dynamic has changed. We're used to, Beth, these last 10 years or so, dealing with governments whose majority was very shaky in Parliament. It's not been unusual for opposition MPs to gang up and defeat the government with rebels on the government side. It's completely changed now in Parliament. This Labour government's got a massive majority. It can steamroller things through. And this sort of parade of independent MPs are pretty impotent. They sort of sit there as a sort of gaggle of sullen parliamentary eunuchs, frankly, because they're not going to be able to deliver anything. But it's a Labour government which is working to get peace in the Middle East. So, look, I'm obviously very shocked and disappointed, but in some ways, if you play this game of politics, you've got to accept that you're going to win and you're going to lose. You've got to take the rough with the smooth. I'm a pretty robust character. I'm a working class lad from Manchester. There's not much phases me. And, I've got to think about my future, but I'll be all right.
He's already all right, listeners, because Jon is now chief executive of the highly influential Starmerite think tank Labour Together, and Morgan McSweeney, who is now head of political strategy in Downing Street, and who, Jon, I imagine you worked with intimately throughout that campaign. He was the director of this think tank. So I think that Jon Ashworth hasn't really gone anywhere. Am I correct, or am I correct?
Well, I'm still on the telly. And this is a think tank which was set up by Keir Starmer's closest allies and was pretty much the vehicle for Keir Starmer becoming the leader of the Labour Party. And it's now thinking about how we win the next general election when that comes in 4 or 5 years' time. So I'm still around. I'm still going to be involved. I'm not going anywhere.
I'm going to put a wager on here with myself, because obviously betting on political events, ill-advised if you're in our business. But I could see a by-election situation where Jon Ashworth is back. Just putting it out there.
Well, all I would say is people got into a lot of trouble betting on politics in recent weeks. So just be careful.
I don't bet. I don't even know how to lay a bet. Well, look, we're going to kick off with this message from Sean. Firstly, I'll go to you, Jon, because Sean asks, as a young male, what's the best way to get into politics? What's your advice?
Oh, my God. So, well, there's obviously 100 different ways to get into politics. I can only talk about my story, which makes me sound like a complete super nerd, because I joined the Labour Party when I was 15. Started going to the constituency Labour Party meetings.
Okay, I need to interrupt already, sorry. Why did you decide to join a political party at the age of 15? That is quite unusual, isn't it?
Well, I was obviously a geek. So this was about 1995 or 1994. Tony Blair had just become leader. Look, this sounds really pious and sanctimonious, but I wanted to change the world, and I felt that, we needed a Labour government, because why were there buckets all over our school, with water leaking in from the roofs and so on. So I joined the Labour Party when I was 15, started going to all the local constituency Labour Party meetings, started doing the leafleting, the door knocking, and I just worked my way up from there. And I got involved in the Student Labour Society at university. I then got a role in the National Student Labour Society, which got me a role at Millbank in the run-up to the 2001 election. And basically, because I was a sort of workaholic, I was there working really late every night. And Gordon Brown's team was looking for a sort of dog's body researcher to do sort of very basic research. And they just sort of like, who's this sort of student guy who always seems to be here? And it was a young Ed Miliband and a young somebody called Spencer Livermore, who's in the House of Lords, who came up to me and said, we're looking for somebody to just do some basic research. We need somebody to collate all the Tory leaflets. This was obviously the days before social media.
Yeah. You had to physically gather them up.
Yeah, I mean, there was the internet, but things weren't really on the internet. And my job was to ring up all these constituency Labour parties across the country and ask them to fax me a copy of Tory leaflets. And we got all these leaflets, and we got all of them saying they wanted to leave the European Union and things like that. And I collated it all and gave a sort of dossier of, I can't remember, 50 Tory candidates breaking Hague's line or whatever it was. And we gave it to Gordon Brown. Literally, Ed Miliband said, just go and give it to Gordon, he's over there. I was absolutely terrified. I said, what? Just go and give it to him, he's over there. So
At the time, he was the Chancellor.
Yeah,
right?
and I went up to Gordon Brown and said, hello. No, yes, where is it? I said, found all these Tory candidates breaking line. Let me see it. This is brilliant. And he then went and did a press conference that afternoon where he stood up at the press conference and said, I can now reveal that 50 Tory candidates have broken Mr. Hague's and Mr. Portillo's line. This is the chaos at the Tory party and all that sort of stuff. And I was like this 21-year-old or whatever at the back of the room, absolutely with my heart in my mouth, thinking, oh my God, this piece of work I've done. We've got Gordon Brown, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is delivering the piece of work that I have done, and it led to like front pages in the more Labour supporting papers and things like that. And the adrenaline buzz I had from that was amazing.
I felt really excited you telling me that story, because that's like, if as a journalist, if you get a scoop and then you reveal it and then you get the adrenaline hit, that must have felt incredible.
It was
didn't it?
incredible. And then what happened was, I really wanted to be a journalist at that point, because I loved the fact that I'd found something and we'd given it to newspapers, and it got on newspaper front pages, and that journalists were talking about it on broadcast. But then what happened is, the Labour Party kept me on to do research into the Tory leadership campaign, because it was Ian Duncan Smith versus
because
Ken
you were
Clarke.
good at it as well,
Yeah,
right?
so they kept me on, and I did that. And then they kept me on a bit longer to do more research. And then eventually, a few years later, when I was 25, I went to work for Gordon Brown directly as one of his special advisors, a very junior bag carrier, T-boy special advisor. And I've been in politics ever since, until it came to a shuddering halt.
Did you ever think, once you'd flipped into actual politics and becoming a politician, did you ever think, oh, I'd rather be a journalist now? You'd rather be a practitioner, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's not, maybe I can go and retrain to be a journalist, who knows, but I mean...
You're doing it, and then we talk about you doing it. I always think that it's probably more interesting to do it, although I can't imagine being a politician.
Jon and I are almost exactly the same age, and I did the other job from that. So I went from university and then joined my local paper and then started reading the news on my local radio station. So in 2001, I was working for the mighty Kingdom FM in Fife, which was Gordon Brown's patch. So every month I would go and interview Gordon Brown about whatever the interview was of the day. So I did do 10 years, 12 years of being a journalist, and then swapped over into politics. It is different. One of you is, it's great being in the stands and supporting your team. It is a different beast being on the pitch. And the one thing that always surprises me is how much we manage to keep out the media, because all of these scandals, one, it's always cock up, it's never conspiracy, nobody's that good, if you're asking, and two, you guys only see about a third of the absolute disaster that's like a hairline away from becoming public, and you save it at the last minute.
Whenever I know someone who's a journalist that goes to the other side, as we call it, I always look at them, I go, have you got 100 stories for me in the first week? And they all look at me and nod and smile, and I think, oh God, just give me your notebook. We've got a quick fire question from Leslie. She asks, why are some new ministers called Right Honourable? Jon, do you know?
Yes, I do. And it's because they're made members of something called the Privy Council. If you're on the Privy Council, that is the historic sort of council of advisors to the monarch. Every cabinet minister is made a member of the Privy Council. Some mid-ranking ministers are sometimes made members of the Privy Council, usually as a sort of, sometimes slightly as a consolation, because they perhaps thought they were going to be made a cabinet minister. But I am a member of the Privy Council.
Me too.
Yeah, well, yeah, you will be, because of your role in the Scottish Parliament as the Conservative leader. And so really you should be introducing me and Ruth as the Right Honourable.
I'll do that from now on. Thank you. I stand corrected.
I was made a member of the Privy Council because if you are to be given access to confidential government information, you need to be trusted, and being sworn into the Privy Council is a sort of sign that you can be trusted. And the reason I was made a member of the Privy Council as a member of the Shadow Cabinet is because of the COVID pandemic. I was the Shadow Health Secretary, and I had to get access to confidential briefings about what's happening in the pandemic early on. By the end, I didn't really get them, but early on, and had to go in for meetings.
It's called Privy Council rules, and Privy Council rules is you can get briefings from officials, and also you are technically an advisor to the monarch, so it comes from like kind of Tudor times and Walsingham and all the rest of it. But there's different levels of it, so there's different committees and stuff that you've got to be involved in, and it's so stuff like the leader of the house does lots of things. So like when Penny Mordaunt was leader of the house, she would do stuff, and then when the monarch dies, and then when there's a new monarch, Privy Councillors have a role to play.
So Ruth, just explain that, because is that why Penny Mordaunt bared the sword? Is that how you say it? Bared the sword?
Exactly. And then you'll also, if you remember, so there was lots of different steps to it. So there was a kind of lying in state in Westminster Hall. There was also like that meeting that they had where all the ex-prime ministers turned up, and everyone was wearing a black suit apart from like Cameron, who wore a blue suit, and everyone was like, what are you doing? And it was to read out like the fact that she's dead, and then to pronounce who the new monarch's going to be, because the Privy Council actually decides who's next in line. Now, like it's very obvious at the moment that Prince Charles became king, he was next in line, but if you think of particularly English history and UK history latterly, it's not always been uncontested. So the Privy Council decides who the next monarch is going to be for the country.
So if you guys were there thinking, why is Penny Mordaunt walking at the King's coronation with that amazing sword, the amazing dress? I mean, I was mesmerised. But if you were wondering why that was happening, it's because she was the leader of the Commons at the time and she had a ceremonial role linked to being a member of the Privy Council. And now I mainly have massive FOMO because I'm not a member of the Privy Council and everyone else seems to be that I know.
So when I joined the Privy Council, it was, you have to have a sort of special ceremony, and it was in lockdown, and Jacob Rees-Mogg was the leader of the Commons, so he chaired this, and Her late Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II, joined us by Zoom. We were in the room in the Cabinet Office, all standing up. We all have to stand, you're not allowed to sit down. And she joined us by Zoom because it was in the pandemic.
Oh, you missed out then, because it's a mad ceremony. There's a whole thing that is in Buckingham Palace that involves stools and orders and like the hand, and like it's properly archaic.
Wow.
I quite like the idea of the late Queen Elizabeth on Zoom. I mean, that's a Zoom call you never forget. Hello, we're back. Now, Emma sent in this question after listening to our episode with Emily Thornberry, where she talked about the abuse she had received when out campaigning in this general election campaign. Emma wants to know, why wasn't this mentioned more during the campaign by the media? The first time I became aware of how toxic it had been was when watching Jess trying to speak at her count. Now, that is a good question because early on in the year, a lot of MPs were very vocal about threats and feeling unsafe, and the government actually announced millions more in security funding to protect them. Jon, do you think media coverage of the campaign reflected what was happening on the ground?
I mean, I thought a lot about this since my loss. I mean, I knew I was having, on the ground, a horrible, horrible time. There were anonymous leaflets going around accusing me of genocide with no, what we call an imprint. If you stand for election and you're putting leaflets out, you have to put something on called an imprint, which says who paid for the leaflet and who published the leaflet. I was being harangued in the street. And it's this new phenomenon, actually, where people will run up to you, they'll stick their iPhone in your face, they'll shout questions at you and barrack you to try and goad you into saying something embarrassing, and you either walk away and then they've got the video of you walking away and they say, oh, look at that coward, or they just sort of film you and they sort of bully you. I took the judgment in the campaign to sort of not make a big fuss about all of this and to try and not make it a sort of national media story, because I didn't think that would help. I didn't think giving it oxygen would help. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe in retrospect I should have done that, and maybe there would have been people who would have, come out and voted for me if they'd known what was going on. I don't know. But this is a really frightening phenomenon in British politics.
What do you think in practical terms needs to change or could change?
I mean, I don't want to sound glib about it, but I'm not sure what could change. Look, if a bunch of idiots want to run up to you and stick their iPhone in your face and shout and scream at you, I mean, what can you do? I mean, I don't like driving. I'm a terrible driver. And my constituency that I represented was a city centre seat. So I used to walk around my constituency all the time. Anybody could come up to me in the street and ask me questions or raise issues. I used to think that it was important to be so accessible and open. I mean, I don't want us to have in British politics like you get in some other countries where politicians are surrounded by bodyguards all the time and the public can't talk to them. But on the other hand, it is becoming more dangerous for politicians.
And Ruth, on the night, we sort of knew that the issue around Gaza, the Israel-Hamas war, how that was affecting some seats, particularly where they were traditionally Labour seats with big Muslim populations, and there was lots of disquiet. We saw it in the West Midlands mayoral race. Jess had told us about that in the centre of Birmingham. Do you think, in retrospect, given that what people have told us now, do you think we undercovered it during the campaign?
Well, I think there's a bit of a balance here, because if I'd been in one of these seats and I'd been running for a mainstream party, if I'd been running for the Labour Party, I'm not sure I would have wanted it to be headline news that all of these seats might fall. Because actually, one of the things that you have when you're part of a mainstream party is that you have organisation, you've got resource, like all of the rest of it, that startups or single issue organisations don't have. So the fact that it wasn't covered might have helped save somebody like Wes Streeting by a few hundred votes, or or Jess Phillips by 1,000 or whatever it was. So I think there's probably quite a good reason that a lot of people didn't necessarily want it to be headline news, that a whole slew of Labour MPs could go with just a few extra votes to the, Stop Gaza Genocide Party or whatever banner they were using. Do I think the media has a responsibility, irrespective of what the politicians want covered, to make sure that they're reflecting what's happening on the ground? Then yes, I do. So it is very hard, though, within the restrictions that you work under, making sure that you report honestly, accurately and fairly. How do you say who's at fault for this? Because quite a lot of it seemed to me very much to be something that was almost peer-to-peer and not organised by an actual registered political party that you had to talk about.
What I would say about it, Emma, is I think you are right that this was a story that perhaps we didn't cover as much as I initially would have wanted. And the reason I say that is after the West Mids mayoral race, because we were up in Birmingham at the count, Jess was there. Afterwards, she and I said, this is a subject that we should do some reporting on, because it's kind of not massively broken into the mainstream, but it's an issue. Then the election got called. And then when you're poll-headed like I am, you're hosting a leaders event, you're covering manifestos, you're chasing Keir Starmer or Sunak around the country. But I wish we had done a longer, more in-depth piece reporting on this. The other thing I would say, though, Emma, is that when we're reporting, and Ruth touched on this, you have to be really careful in constituency level. So part of the reason that Jess wasn't on the pod is that if we had Jess on the pod and she's campaigning for a seat, we'd have to have all the other candidates campaigning to make sure it's fair and balanced, and that we're not favouring one candidate over another. And that actually, in practical terms, makes individual constituency reporting in general election campaigns really difficult, because if you have one candidate on in a constituency, you then have to represent all of the candidates, which is only fair, right? Because you can't, as a media organisation, look like you're favouring one candidate over other candidates. So constituency level reporting is quite difficult. But I think as a theme, this is something that was underreported. But I also think, as Jon said, and Jon, I think you'd say this is fair, I think a lot of MPs did not want this reported on because you just wanted to get on with your campaigns, right?
Well, exactly. Yeah, that was the judgment I took. I decided I didn't want to make a big national fuss out of this, which I obviously could have done, because I was on the television every single day, more or less.
Yes.
So it's not like I didn't have a platform not to, but I sort of thought it was better not to give it oxygen.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know in retrospect whether that was a mistake or not. But as I say, you've got to look to the future.
I mean, I don't think you should beat yourself up too much, Beth, on the grounds that in terms of the top 12 stories from this election, that's the dog that didn't bark. Yes, it cost Jon his seat, and that is really difficult in his part of Leicester. It arguably saved Ian Duncan-Smith's seat, but apart from 2 seats in a 650-seat election, it came close but didn't depose people. So their big stories are the collapse of the Tory party, collapse of the SNP, the rise of Keir Starmer and his impregnable majority. You've then got issues regarding immigration that came to the fore, the rise of reform. So you look at what are the big lines, and actually you guys pretty much covered them.
I don't disagree with anything you've said there. The only thing I would say is when you say it's the dog that didn't bark, you mean that in terms of like loads of seats didn't fall, but what has come out from underneath this is a kind of corrosive aggression on the ground in our politics, and that matters. And I think if we report that and show that, then it prompts an open discussion about what's right, what's wrong about that, and how we might improve it. So, but I agree with you in terms of a theme. It was definitely there, but it didn't translate into kind of defeats en masse on the night. But look, we've got to move on. I'm moving on to reasons to be hopeful. This is a question from Sue. She says, could you please explain to our 29-year-old daughter, Hannah, why she should be more hopeful for the future? I'm going to start with Jon. Ruth, I'm coming to you, so have a think about it. Jon, you first.
Well, I mean, I don't know anything about Hannah's circumstances, but I can probably guess by her age that she's probably renting at the moment, probably paying a lot of rent, and there's all kinds of insecurities associated with renting, probably been struggling to get on the housing ladder. And I think she can be hopeful, because I think one of the things that Keir Starmer's government is going to do is build homes. And there's going to be some big battles on that, because some of what would have been my parliamentary colleagues, perhaps in seats they were not expecting to win, will probably have a lot of constituents who don't want the homes built in their areas. But Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are determined to build these homes, and I'm in favour of building homes. I think we need to build homes. So I think that I'm making a big assumption there about Hannah, but there will be homes for people who are now 29 and are struggling to get on the housing ladder, and there's going to be good, well-paid jobs as well because of all the transition to the green industrial plan that Ed Miliband and others are putting in. So I think Hannah can be hopeful.
So, Sue, there you go. Hannah, Keir Starmer's going to build her a home and give her a job in green energy, says Jon Ashworth.
Absolutely.
There you go. You've heard it on this pod. Ruth, what would you pick?
So I would say that we should be hopeful because good people pulling together to work hard can change the world, because that's all that's only ever changed the world. And I think the thing that's disheartening at the moment is that there are a lot of very loud voices out there on the extremes, but they are extreme and they're on the fringes and they're small factions, and the majority of people in this country are good people that want to see things get better, not for themselves necessarily, but for others. And I think that one of the sadnesses for me as the mum of a young child is how much anxiety particularly young people have about the state of the world. But there's also the fact that they care so much. They care about the environment. They don't care about national borders so much. They care if there is a child that is in extreme poverty in India, in the same way as they would care about a child in extreme poverty if they lived on their street. They see the world in a way where it is not about, and actually we've seen this in terms of changes of national studies of policy areas here. People are more concerned about good public services than they are about how much they pay in lowering taxes. So you see that the mindset of the vast majority of people are not those folks screaming from the hard left or the hard right on the internet. It's about people that want to improve their community, improve their world, are happy to sacrifice a little bit from themselves if it helps others. And that, I think, is always a reason to be hopeful. Always.
Okay, so that's, I feel quite uplifted there.
It is.
I enjoyed that. It's true, young people really do care about the environment. My children care
so much about what happens in the world.
Yeah. You can always learn from your kids, can't you? That is for sure. Look, that is all we have time for. We'll be back next week with more answers to your questions and another special guest. We still want to hear from you. Email us on electoraldysfunction@sky.uk or send us your messages and voice notes on the burner phone. It's 07934 200 444. Jonathan, hang on, let me correct that. The Right Honourable Jonathan Ashworth, Privy Council. I'm sure that means you've got letters after your name. Thank you for becoming the first male politician to appear on Electoral Dysfunction. How was it for you?
It was an honour. It was a privilege. Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Loved having you on. Thank you, Jonathan
Thanks for
Ashworth,
having me.
Right Honourable Gentleman Jonathan Ashworth. And Ruth, did you enjoy having John on?
I did. Our paths haven't crossed. I've always thought you were a good sort, Jonathan. So
Same to you, and I didn't realise that we were so close in age. So
Yeah.
maybe we should have a joint birthday party or something.
maybe we should have a joint birthday party.
This post-divisive politics world, man, it's too much for me. So look, thank you, Jon Ashworth. Ruth, I'm going to say goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.